There's only one class in the community that thinks more about money than the rich, and that is the poor. The poor can think of nothing else. Oscar Wilde.
Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. This is another old money episode, and we're going to be talking about class hierarchies around the world. One of the biggest tricks really played on society is that class no longer exists in the modern West. That is hardly the case, and that's where we're going to get started. And I chose for the cover image polo players because if you live outside of Argentina and you play polo at least once a week, you're definitely a member of the elite. So let's get started really with how class hierarchies used to work in ancient and medieval times. I'm going to use medieval Europe as my example here. You had a monarch who ruled and had not entirely absolute power, but they were the top of the social hierarchy. They had most of the wealth and they had the majority of the political control. The next level below that were the nobles, who had more local political control, and they also were considerably wealthy and had a disproportionate amount of the money. This pyramid makes them look like a decent chunk of the population, but just most medieval societies, the monarch and the nobles and those who directly worked under them or their families consisted of 5% or less of the population, if even that. The next levels are the knights and the vassals. The knights were basically like the medieval version of the police force. Their main role was really just to enforce the current social system for the monarch and the nobles and to defend the nobles' estates. The vassals were kind of lower nobles. They also were bureaucratic class in many European countries. And then the next level were the urban working class, which were independent farmers, craftsmen, artisans, merchants. There weren't that many of them because it was a very rural society. But they at least had, and they didn't have much money, but at least they had some agency. They weren't tied to a particular plot of land. And they couldn't, in theory, at least eke out an independent living. But they really couldn't gain any sort of political power or status. And then the bottom level were the peasants or the serfs, different names depending on what part of the world you're in. And these people were basically just one step above slavery. They technically weren't slaves, but they were contracted to land and they didn't really ever make enough money to not be indebted to their noble who owned the land. And so they were stuck, and they were stuck being the source of labor to feed everybody else. And then there were the ecclesiastical authorities of the church who did kind of assist in the academic and legal and political side of things that people who in a literate society needed educated, learned people to help manage. They weren't really in the system because there were poor priests and friars whose living standards were probably as bad as many of the serfs, up to the Pope, whose power could rival or even exceed monarchs. So the church doesn't really traditionally fit within the pyramid. And in modern times, people really think of the class system more or less like I'm going to stop there. The modern class system is looked typically at a pyramid type model too, where instead of really just being forced into a certain class by birth based on who your parents were and permanently being stuck there in a feudal pyramid, it's based on income and education. So the less amount of education and the less amount of income you have, the lower class you have. So at the bottom of the lower class are people who failed to finish high school and are wards of the state or just homeless or whatever. Then you have the working class, which are people who probably did finish high school but never went to college and work more menial type jobs that are enough to support themselves but leave little left over. A lower middle class is people who maybe have an associate's degree and have a slightly better job than the working class, but still not much left over to build any meaningful savings. They could maybe buy a low-end house. That's about it. Then you have the upper middle class, which are what people think of as more bachelor and above education. They have professional type jobs. They live in well-to-do suburbs. They can afford to pay for their kids' college education. The lower middle class, if they're usually their kids, if they go to college, they'll have to take on student loans, whereas the upper middle class generally would not, or take on a lot less student loans. But they still have to work their entire lives. And then there's the upper class, which are the Ivy League educated, master's, PhD, or MBAs at prestigious schools, or they're the politicians, they're business leaders. They're the people who run things, and political power also moves up. You have more of it the higher you move up the ladder, but it's not entirely correlated like it was in the feudal model. Both of these systems are wrong. This whole 5-class model that I'm using here as an example is a really big misconception. One, it doesn't apply everywhere in the world. And two, every real region has different types of class hierarchies. With this class structure series, I was originally going to make these all into one video, but instead, just given the size and complexity of the analysis of each type of social hierarchical system, I'm going to split it into 5 parts. The first part being the explanation of the medieval system and the conventional class system, which is just generally a flawed model. The second one, I'm going to talk about the American class system. The third one, I'm going to be talking about authoritarian class hierarchies. Then I'm going to talk about emerging market democratic class hierarchies. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the Western European social model. And then I'll have a conclusion about why all of this matters. And with that, let's get started with this series.